Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Well, Happy New Year and welcome to another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Ann Hamilton is on assignment in a sunny, undisclosed location, but the balance of our prescient panel of pundits is here to kick off 2013 as we consider isolating Assad. As embattled Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad's grip on power continues to slip, opposition leaders have insisted on his exit as a precondition for talks. How long can he hang on, and what might follow his departure? Bibi and the ballot box. Following snap elections scheduled for January 22nd, Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu could find himself heading the most right-leaning coalition government in the nation's history. What might this mean for relations with the second Obama administration? Doctor's excuse. Venezuelan officials are wondering how to handle the scheduled January 10th inauguration of President Hugo Chavez if the guest of honor is unable to attend. The ailing leader has not been seen publicly since mid-December. Should this be the end of Chavez, can his Bolivarian revolution survive him? And keep calm and carry on. With his Senate confirmation widely acknowledged to be a mere formality, John Kerry is poised to be the next U.S. Secretary of State. We'll take a look at how some of his predecessors were able to shape American foreign policy and what he might bring to the job. Well, John, Robert, Happy New Year. Welcome back.
Happy New Year to you and all the savages at home.
Well,
Robert, to you and your mother.
Let's start with Syria, with just sort of a snapshot of where we are on the ground and what sort of scope of violence are we talking about, John? Maybe you could take a swing at that.
Well, the UN now says that 60,000 have died in the Syrian conflict, which is now about 22 months old, starting in March of 2011. And the UN negotiator, mediator, Brahimi, is still hopeful about some sort of a negotiated settlement. But what we have on the ground is really a sectarian battle between a Sunni majority and a Alawite, very small minority. Within that, the Ba'ath Party, which has been controlling affairs in Syria for quite a while, with a 10% Christian overlay on this process. There have been a number of defections from Assad's military, civil, police apparatus, but most knowledgeable observers say that they're not critical to his survival. We have seen a increasing escalation in terms of the weaponry that's being involved and the level of violence. And the violence is flowing on both sides. I mean, this is not a good guy, bad guy kind of thing. There are bad guys on both sides.
So in terms of just real estate, Robert, what's the situation? I mean, is the opposition actually able to hold territory at this point?
Certainly in the north part of the country, and there's a growing sense, and maybe sometimes people's perception is not reality on the ground, but there's a growing sense that Assad is likely to lose, and that's very different than it was, say, a year ago. And so now there's even possible planning between great powers about what to do in a post-Assad era and what that would look like. And so there's a school of thought that a negotiated settlement is less likely than it was before, and there may be an outright rebel victory. There's also a school of thought that negotiated settlements don't usually work that well because both sides have to take too many risks in disarming to actually make them work when there's no trust whatsoever. And so, but it really, since we have not, the United States is certainly not involved militarily beyond our control largely, but really people are beginning to plan for a post-Assad era, and there's difference of opinion on whether that would be even more destabilizing or whether or not it couldn't be worse than the Assad regime anyway, both domestically and in terms of their effect on stability in the Middle East.
Well, John Robert references great power machinations behind the scenes. What about the Russian dimension?
Well, let me even back off a touch more from that and talk about the international dimension, starting with the region itself. Because what we're seeing as we described this Sunni Alawite conflict within Syria itself, we're also talking in the regional sense about the Sunni versus the Shia. And then you have Saudi Arabia, who is the champion and the bankroller for much of the Sunni interests. And we have Iran, which has been supporting the Alawites as well as the Shia causes throughout the Arab world. So you've got that dimension. And then you have Israel there that is unlikely to gain anything from either conclusion. So whatever Syria comes out of this is not going to be more likely to support Israeli interests. And then we have the Russian and Chinese. The Russians have been arms supplier to the Syrians for a number of years. And they and the Chinese have a particular attitude in international fora about the interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states. And so they are likely to be able to frustrate at the UN level, at the Security Council level, any kind of effort on the part of the Western, of other nations to be able to find a conclusion that doesn't fit with what their interests are in the area.
But there's an apparent evolution in the Russian position regarding Assad particularly, isn't there?
Well, and there are rumors that the U.S. and the Russians are now talking to each other about a possible conclusion. But one of the things that bothers me about political settlements is, and I saw this in Yugoslavia as it was coming apart, when people don't lose battles, when there isn't a clear-cut winner and a loser, all you're doing is postponing the results for another day. I mean, Serbs are still not reconciled to the idea that Kosovo is gone. Bosnia is still divided into 3 states.
So, Robert, what about Obama's engagement or lack thereof to date? Is his second administration likely to approach this situation any differently, do you think?
Well, it's possible, and they'll be more engaged in the Middle East. But in Syria, it's hard to see that there's a highly significant role for the United States, given that it seems to be off the table that would be involved militarily in any way. Now, if a new regime was to come to power, right, how the administration dealt with that regime, it could be very, very significant. And obviously, if there was any kind of connection with Israel, it would probably have to come through the United States initially. So at this point, it's really waiting to see whether or not the prognostications are true that the Assad regime is about to fall. Then things change a great deal, and a strong Secretary of State, for example, might be able to play a major role.
Well, what about the idea that, in as much as the U.S. as well as other governments have openly called for Assad's departure, if the longer he lasts, is that corrosive of U.S. credibility in the region?
I think that's overstated. In other words, there'll be that kind of spin. Certainly partisan opponents will say that, right? But I think most people are beyond the idea that the United States can snap its finger and cause whatever it wants to happen in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world for that matter.
Well, and feeding off of that, I think the viewers should be aware that this is one of those very complicated situations where there are no easy answers. That when people begin to throw out labels like democracy and freedom, they get more complicated when you get on the ground and you find out that the guy who you think is a freedom fighter has just killed off 20, 30 people on the opposition. So it really does pay for our viewers to make sure that they get a much broader view than some very simple conclusion.
Well, let's stay in the region, move on to another story. There'll be an election in Israel on January 22nd. By all accounts, it looks likely that Benjamin Netanyahu will retain his role, is it not?
The polling, it's harder to poll there because you have a parliamentary system with a lot more fragmentation, and then you have a lot of different combinations that will produce the coalition that's a majority. So it's not like an American election that way, but it appears that the right will have more seats and more power, no matter how you cut it, than they did before. And you already have an Israel that's tilted very far to the militarist side and military solutions, and increasingly cut off not just from the UN, but increasingly even from the EU nations. And so it looks like Israel is continuing to move away from any concept of a peace process and more towards a military solution to a problem that long-term cannot be solved entirely through the military. But that puts the United States in a difficult position because it greatly reduces the options for any legitimate peace or serious peace process.
And also giving more specificity to that militarist approach. First of all, we're talking about Iran and possibility of taking action against Iran. And the second of all, three of the right-wing parties that might be aligned with Netanyahu in the next government are talking about annexing what are we talking about? The West Bank areas, and just moving forward without any consideration for legality in this on this subject.
Well, one of the things that people like to comment on is just the personal chemistry between the two leaders, Obama and Netanyahu, and one of the interesting aspects of the American election was a fairly overt endorsement of Mr. Romney on the part of Mr. Netanyahu. Do you think that's likely to impact things, or was the situation already about as frosty as it was likely to get? Well,
I mean, it's unusual for that to happen, particularly given that both political parties in the U.S. have been strong allies to Israel, and so there's obviously not much of a relationship, but it goes beyond personal here. There's just a difference in approach, right? President Obama can't, because of domestic considerations, be completely at odds with Israel, but Israel now is completely uninterested in a peace process and is seeking a purely military solution. And so it adds to it, but I mean, it's not as if it's been termed a big mistake on Netanyahu's part, but I don't think it really has made matters any worse than they would have been already, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't think it really in long term is going to have much effect, simply because, as Robert was saying, both political parties and across the spectrum are pretty strong supporters of Israel.
So if indeed prognosticators have it right, and after the election the coalition that governs is more to the right, and as you suggest, John, more hawkish, what does that do to the likelihood of some sort of preemptive strike on Iran, do you think? I mean, is this something that is a realistic possibility, and more so because of that kind of result?
Well, Israel is going to represent its best interests. They're not going. There are consequences if they were to move when we didn't want them to, and there's a tremendous amount of assistance that we provide, and that could be a tipping point in terms of whether or not that continues, that level of assistance. But we don't control Israel. We can influence the process. We might be able to even influence which parties he is going to negotiate with for his coalition, but probably not.
It's more dangerous. It's more likely. The question of whether they would actually pull the trigger, right, so to speak, one doesn't know. There's also, John says, interests that could be threatened, and they may not want to be further isolated from the rest of the world. But on the other hand, they are extremely anxious about the Iranian nuclear program, and so just from the standpoint of their belief, the people who believe mostly we should take strong action and military action against such a threat are going to be much more in control. So it's a possibility. I hope we don't have, a Dr. Strangelove-like situation, but it's more likely with this than if we had a center-left coalition controlling Israeli politics right now.
Also remember that the Israeli electorate is moved towards the right, towards a more military solution. He wouldn't be elected if the people weren't moving in the same direction.
Well, we'll head to a different part of the world, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back with more World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Well, welcome back, and we'll be moving a little closer to home now. There's a scheduled inauguration of a new head of state on January 10th. Hugo Chavez is to start another administration following elections there in October. But the wrinkle in that process is he's incapacitated and in a hospital in Cuba. So, Robert, what are the alternatives? Were January 10th to come around and he's unable to take the oath?
Well, I mean, there's a constitutional dispute that parallels, say, our disputed 2000 election. There's disagreement. It appears the Constitution says that you have to be sworn in January 10th or else, but then there's also other parts of the Constitution other people have talked about, like a Supreme Court possibly swearing it in. Date is not mentioned, so some people think it should be January 10th as well. So it might well be that you would have to have a very immediate election, or maybe not. I mean, so we don't know what's going to happen. He has named a successor, which is a real step towards admitting that he's very, very ill and may pass from the scene. But that successor would have to win an election. And of course, he might have to run against the opposition leader who ran against Chavez last time and had a stronger coalition against him. So it's obviously a very uncertain situation constitutionally as far as how it's going to turn out.
It's raw politics. It's what the problem I see it as. His designated replacement, Maduro, lacks the charisma that Chavez has. I mean, he was a school bus driver. Now, there's lots of people move past driving a school bus onto many important things, but that's part of his. He was recently the foreign minister. There's a very key election, a gubernatorial election that's coming up, where Capriles, who was the opponent of Chavez in the October election and lost, is running to be reelected to the governorship of the Caracas area, the most important part of Venezuela, and if he were to be defeated in that, this obviously would undermine the opposition's ability to mount an attack, mount a successful campaign for the presidency. If he's successful, then the National Assembly can do some very interesting things for 90 days and 90 days in extending the time that the president can be away. So as long as Chavez is alive, there are machinations possible to be able to prolong the process.
Well, one of the reasons that we're even talking about this, I think, is Chavez's role as sort of the iconic leader of this Bolivarian sort of populist movement in Latin America. Is this something that can survive his passing?
There's not a clear successor, right? And it was based on his charisma. Largely. So I guess we will find out whether there's a firmer foundation that's been built and whether there are additional leaders that will arise, maybe more of a multi-leader kind of setup than one dominant leader. But at this point, the only thing we know about that's really holding it together is his charisma, and that appears to be passing from the scene. Of course, every country has a problem with when a leader is incapacitated, systems you can write the perfect constitution. Someone has to designate that they're incapacitated. No one ever wants to do it. We had this with Woodrow Wilson, during the negotiations over the peace treaty and the League of Nations after World War I in this country.
Well, how is the Bolivarian project really shaped out at the street level? And what's the Venezuelan economy look like right now?
Well, it's actually not doing so well as far as I know. I didn't look very deeply into that part of it, but from a previous discussion we had on this a few months ago, the economy was in trouble. Oil revenues were down. One of the big losers most likely would be Cuba, who has this very strong interest in how this comes out. I actually found that a very interesting editorial in the Tehran Times, which has been supportive of Chavez.
I didn't know you had renewed your subscription.
Digitally. But Cuba has received billions in oil support and other kinds of support from Venezuela, and that would be a crippling blow to their economy.
Well, there's been some sort of tentative feelers on the part of the U.S. administration towards sort of a post-Chavez Venezuela. Robert, how is that shaped out today?
Well, I mean, the idea is that perhaps there doesn't need to be this, it's really a Cold War, a cool war between the two countries if Chavez is off the scene. And so there's already been discussion. That's going to be a test of how much of a Bolivarian revolution it really is. I mean, a lot of what's been excited people in Latin America about the revolution is just someone standing up, to the great dominant colossus of the North, right? But you also have other models. Brazil is standing up in a very different way by becoming itself a major economic power in the world.
Brazil has actually preempted Venezuela as the spokesperson for Latin America.
And Brazil doesn't get its power just from tweaking the tiger, so to speak. It has more oomph itself. And so it plays a role. It's all part of this whole development of South America being much more of a serious and closer to equal partner, not fully equal partner with the United States. And that'll become more and more the case as the century goes along.
This is one of those areas that every president, when he comes into office, talks about changing the page in terms of our relations with that part of the world, and we never do.
Well,
good neighbor policy, right?
Well, the standard bearer for whatever policy obtains in the second Obama administration looks likely to be Senator Kerry. So, John, you served under the Secretary of State. Tell us, how much does that position really impact U.S. foreign policy? How much does the person shape the policy?
Well, there has been evolution in the office. I think it was more powerful 20, 30 years ago than it is now. The Defense Department has grabbed a share of that more recently simply because of the wars we've been involved in. But the choice of Kerry is of a model where you have a political figure with a persona of his own that has a level of independence of thinking that has credibility internationally. My take on Susan Rice as his original choice was that she was a second-tier player. And my larger concern was that she was extremely idealistic in terms of her outlook on foreign policy, and was more likely to get us involved in messes abroad than a more realistic position, Secretary of State.
Well, so Robert, what does it say about Obama's foreign policy goals for his second administration that he went with Kerry? Was it just the easy thing to do because his confirmation seems less fraught with peril, certainly.
So it was easier to appoint a senator. The senators give themselves a pass, right, usually. It's more of a throwback. I mean, it really has been a while since Secretary of States had been former presidential candidates, potential presidents. That's the way it was earlier in the Republic. It was the Secretary of States became presidents, or quite often that hadn't been the case for a long time. But now he's had two of them, Hillary Clinton and probably John Kerry. The thing about Kerry is he's experienced, he has his own knowledge and following, so he can be a major player. He can bring more power to the office. He's also a man who's complicated. And so he has that idealism of the soldier who went and spoke truth to power during congressional hearings, which brought him into prominence about the Vietnam War and what a nightmare it had been. But on the other hand, he's a very cautious person who's been in Washington a long time. And so some people talk of kind of two warring Kerrys, the one who wants to go and spread democracy and do something and be ambitious to be one of the great Secretary of States, and the one who is a cautious player who understands all the pitfalls of doing that. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I think his ambition may make him want to do something that leaves more of a mark than, say, Hillary Clinton did. I don't know if there's a real opportunity to bring, say, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, to make progress there, given what we talked about earlier in the show, but perhaps there are other opportunities he'll be looking for. I think if he sees a major opportunity for a major diplomatic breakthrough anywhere in the world, that he probably will take the bull by the horns and try to make his impact.
John, we've got about 30 seconds left. What would be some logical metric of success for Senator Kerry or any Secretary of State?
The denuclearization of North Korea, a international agreement on nuclear weapons in Iran. I would not put the Middle East peace process in the mix. It looks like it's going to become more complicated than in the short term, at least.
Well, that looks like a substantial enough to-do list, at least for the first few months. So we'll keep an eye on that. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,